Good morning. I'm Natalie McSherry. I'm the president of the Maryland State Bar Association. For 125 years, the Maryland State Bar Association has been the home and the voice of all of the legal professionals in Maryland, lawyers, judges, law students, paralegals, over 40,000. We connect our members and the public with important leaders around the state, and we talk about issues that matter to you. In this election cycle, we've already concluded interviews with all of the candidates for the gubernatorial campaign, and we will host debates with them this summer at our legal conference in Ocean City and again in the fall. My co-host today is Bobby Zirkin, a former senator and attorney who works at the MSBA on our advocacy efforts. And our current Attorney General, Brian Frosh, is retiring after an incredible career where he has served Marylanders on the local and national level and had an excellent relationship with the MSBA and the MSBA's Access to Justice Commission. We look forward to having the same with our next Attorney General for the great state of Maryland. And to that end, we are meeting today with Representative Anthony Brown, who is a candidate to be the next Attorney General for Maryland. So to start off, the Maryland State Bar Association, as I said, is the largest association representing a wide array of attorneys across the state at all levels of their careers. We have law student members, young lawyers, mid-level associates. What led you to choose a career in public service? Why was that important to you?
Sure. Let me start, though, first by saying thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Bobby. Bobby and I go way back in our time in the General Assembly. And I want to thank you not only for having me in today for this interview, but also for your leadership at the Maryland State Bar Association, an extraordinary organization, supporting the legal profession, grooming, developing, assisting the profession so it can be its very best for Marylanders. And whether you're a solo practitioner, finding yourself in district court every day, or a big M&A transactional attorney at one of Maryland's big law firms, the Bar Association certainly has been an invaluable organization for those attorneys, current and future generations. I chose the path of public service basically because of the household I grew up in. My father is an immigrant to this country who was born and raised in Jamaica in a one-bedroom home by his grandparents on a dirt floor. And he was the first in our family to attend college. And he came to the United States to do that. And then after graduating from medical school and proving that not every doctor is wealthy, he raised 5 kids in a 3-bedroom home. I saw every day my father in service to others. He practiced medicine in some of the poorest neighborhoods and hospitals near where I grew up in New York. What my father didn't sort of make in compensation was certainly returned in the reward and satisfaction that he got, knowing that he made a difference in the lives of the people he served. So I grew up understanding the importance of service. I didn't go on to be a doctor in my father's footsteps, but another noble profession, and I decided to go to law school because I thought through the law I could make a tremendous impact in the lives of people. So I chose law after spending 5 years in the United States Army, which is also really good public service to our nation. Since law school, have tried to find opportunities as a lawyer, as a public servant, to make a difference in the lives of people who I meet, who I work for, who I work with.
And picking up on that, can we talk about your career and what in your career, in the various positions that you've mentioned, and the skills and relationships you obtained there, what will help you in those to become a better Attorney General?
Sure. I think, starting from my early days at Wilmer Hale, it was then Wilmer Cutler Pickering, Lloyd Cutler, and was one of the name partners. Steve Sachs, a former Attorney General, now dearly departed Steve, a good friend who was a partner at the firm. Those were really formative years for me as an attorney. Not only sharpening my skills in analyzing and understanding complex facts and applying them to the law, all in an effort to serve your client, to do good. But also, how to interact with clients and meet them where they are. I took a lot of pride in the pro bono work that I did at Wilmer Cutler Pickering. In fact, in my last year there, I received a pro bono award because I spent so much time representing indigent clients, either in misdemeanor cases, winning the largest award for an unnamed plaintiff in a class action suit against the Lorton Correctional Facility in Virginia, which is now closed. But really meeting clients where they are, trying to understand their conditions, their circumstances in life, and then using the skills, the training, the passion for the work to make a difference. So I would say those formative years at Wilmer are really what has prepared me the most for a life career in public service.
What is it that brings you to seek election for the office of Attorney General at this time?
Well, you may or may not remember when I was in the Maryland General Assembly, I deployed to Iraq. I got a set of orders to go to Iraq. It was a difficult decision. People asked me, look, you're a member of the General Assembly. You must know somebody. Certainly you can get out of this deployment. But I knew that if I didn't go, someone else would go. Someone else's niece or nephew or son, daughter, father, or mother. And the military had been good to me. This country had been good to me. So I answered the call and I went to Iraq. And when I returned, with really a renewed sense of sort of service. I mean, I had seen some really bad things in Iraq, but I worked with wonderful patriotic Americans. I returned to Maryland thinking, how can I make a bigger impact in the lives of the people I serve? So I was in the General Assembly. I actually contemplated and started a campaign for Attorney General. It was me, it was a few others, Doug Gansler, Tom Perez. We were all awaiting Joe Curran to announce his retirement. And then in the intervening time, Martin O'Malley asked me to join him as lieutenant governor. And I did, and we had a great 8 years, the work that we did. But just like then, 16 years ago, today I'm looking for an opportunity to make an even bigger impact in the lives of Marylanders. When Brian Frosch announced that he was going to retire, I thought, my team and I, we're making a big difference in Washington. Right, and the work that we're doing on the Armed Services Committee and the Transportation Infrastructure Committee was important, and we're getting a lot done. But the opportunity to lead an office of 700 professionals, 450 lawyers, investigators, and support staff, continuing to work on the issues that have been important to me, whether it's healthcare or education, whether it's champion the interests of constituents or consumers through the Consumer Protection Division. The Office of the Attorney General is an opportunity for me working with these professionals to make a tremendous impact. Now 16 years later with a lot more experience, both in leadership, in leading state government, and as we all know, the state government is the client of the Attorney General, but also representing and advocating people as a member of the legislature and in Congress. I know how to fight for the people, and that's a very important client for the Attorney General. So now is the time.
Well, and you've mentioned that the people of Maryland are your clients. So how do you see the role of the Attorney General in Maryland, and what would be your top 3 priorities in that role?
Sure. Well, by definition, the Attorney General has to and does represent the state of Maryland, all of its vast departments and agencies, from environment to labor and everything in between. But you also are the people's lawyer, right? Whether through the Consumer Protection Division, even the Antitrust Division, the work that you do in advising the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights and protecting the civil rights of Marylanders. So you really have 2 clients as the Attorney General. And I think the real challenge sometimes will be, how do you represent both of those clients and do it effectively? How do you represent the state of Maryland, the Department of Corrections, okay, yet also make sure that the men and women who are inmates at those facilities, their rights are also protected. So that's a real challenge for the Attorney General. I see 3, going right to your question on priorities. There are so many priorities, but I knew that you were going to ask me 3, so you got to boil it down, right? You
got to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. I think one of the most important roles that the Attorney General plays, although it may not be the largest role, is that in public safety. As a chief legal officer, you have not only a voice, but you have tools and resources to advance the public safety mission in Maryland. Whether it's through the Criminal Investigation Division or the Criminal Appeals Division, you've got investigators and prosecutors who are doing important work, whether it's addressing gun trafficking, the multi-jurisdictional offenses, or when you are backstopping states' attorneys and local law enforcement as they prioritize the cases that they're going to prosecute, investigate and prosecute in their local jurisdiction. So the Attorney General plays a really important role. Just last year, the General Assembly gave the Attorney General greater authority to investigate police-involved deaths. And Brian Frosch has been setting up that investigatory unit. And the next question that has to be answered by the General Assembly is whether or not you're going to extend that authority to prosecuting law enforcement if the investigation suggests that a prosecution is warranted. So the Attorney General plays an important role in public safety as well as police accountability, and I would continue to prioritize as the Attorney General. Another area that would be of top priority is worker rights and protections. What do we mean by that? Things like, pay theft, wage theft, which is happening across Maryland. Right? Employers not paying their employees what they deserve, what they've earned through a good day's work. So you've got wage theft. You have issues around misclassification, where employers, typically on a construction work site, tries to avoid paying payroll taxes and provide other benefits to employees, so they classify them as independent contractors, depriving them of some of the rights and benefits of the labor laws in Maryland. And also labor trafficking, that's on the rise. We often think about human trafficking, sex trafficking. There's also labor trafficking. So as the Attorney General, I am going to, in my first session with the General Assembly, create in statute a worker protection unit so that we can use the expertise of the office, the attorneys, and the investigators who today support the Department of Labor in taking those actions. I'm going to go to the General Assembly and ask for the authority to create a unit that can independently bring labor enforcement or labor standard enforcement cases. So that's priority number 2. Now the third, boy, I don't know where to go because there's so many important priorities, but I would have to say number 3 is in the area of environmental enforcement. And much like labor enforcement, when it comes to environmental enforcement in Maryland, if the Department of the Environment and the Department of Natural Resources are willing to investigate and bring an enforcement action, then they'll do that and they'll turn it over to the Attorney General. But we see in Annapolis right now, they're holding hearings because the Department of the Environment is under-resourced and not conducting the environmental investigations that they should be. Now, not to get partisan, but we have seen in the past in Maryland, under Republican governors, an unwillingness to enforce environmental standards. So I think that the Attorney General should have the independent enforcement authority to both investigate and, where the facts warrant, to prosecute those environmental polluters, those who ignore the environmental standards, environmental laws, so that we can make sure that whether it's the Chesapeake Bay or any other environmental features in Maryland, the water, the air is clean for all Marylanders. So that would be my third priority, and believe me, there are a lot more. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, though, because Attorney General Frosch has also had a record of representing Maryland, both in those kinds of local issues that you just mentioned and on some more national issues as well. Do you see the focus of your office being different from that, or how would you handle that?
I want to build on what Brian's done. And in fact, in 2017, and you're referencing the Maryland Defense Act. In 2017, the Maryland General Assembly, and Brian worked closely with them, passed the Maryland Defense Act, which gave the Attorney General the authority to either bring or join lawsuits, actions against the federal government when actions and decisions by the federal government were doing harm to Maryland. Now, a lot of Marylanders know about the Emoluments Clause case that Brian brought, which essentially brought an action against former President Trump himself. But Brian's office of the Attorney General did a whole lot more than filing lawsuits against Donald Trump, all of them well-deserved, believe me. He filed actions against the EPA when they rolled back environmental standards. He filed actions against or joined actions against the Department of Labor when they weren't enforcing labor standards. Brian's office even filed an action against the U.S. Department of Education when we passed the CARES Act money, all that pandemic relief to go to our schools. Well, under the Department of Education, the Trump Department of Education, they tried to dilute the formula that negatively impacted Maryland schools, Maryland school children. Brian brought an action there. So certainly building on Brian's work in enforcing the law, in defending and protecting Marylanders when the federal government was doing wrong. But I want to take that one step further, though. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to go to the General Assembly and say, just as you gave the Attorney General the authority to file an action against the federal government when they do harm and injury to Marylanders, I want to ask for independent authority to protect Marylanders against civil rights violations done by private sector. If there's a civil rights violation in the workplace or in housing or in accommodations, today the Attorney General advises the Civil Rights Commission. The Attorney General can direct plaintiffs to different resources that they can take in filing a lawsuit. But today the Attorney General does not step in the shoes of Marylanders to file those actions. In many states, the Attorney General can, not in Maryland. I'll go to the General Assembly and ask for that authority to protect Marylanders against civil rights violations.
Interesting.
All right, well, I'm going to, interesting to hear your top priorities, and again, on behalf of the bar, welcome here. I'm going to ask about some specific issues, some more or less related to the Attorney General, and just kind of get your thoughts about them. And the first one, not to jump into too controversial of a topic, is one that the Attorney General will be in court for, and actually is in court right now, and that's the issue of redistricting. And I guess the general question is, and it goes along with what Natalie was talking about, is the role of the Attorney General. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a redistricting fight in both the Court of Appeals and in the Circuit Court right now, one dealing with congressional redistricting, which I know you know a lot about,
yep,
and one dealing with the legislative. Where do you fall down, I guess, philosophically on the issue? Governor Hogan's talked about wanting to have and put together an independent commission versus what is done all over the country, which is political redistricting. You know, the politicians who are in charge get to decide the new maps. Where do you fall on that? And I guess as your role of the Attorney General, what is your role in dealing, if you disagree with where the state is or the legislature is?
Sure. And that's going to be a tough decision. It's a tough decision for every attorney, whether you're the Attorney General or whether you're an attorney in private practice. Often your client comes to you with a case. You recognize that the client has to have his or her day in court. And you as the attorney have to put on the very best case to promote, defend, or prosecute that case, even sometimes when your personal opinion may differ from that of your client. But look, the Attorney General has a responsibility to advise the Maryland General Assembly, because essentially you're not defending the governor's map. This is a map that was enacted, both the congressional map and the state legislative maps, by the General Assembly. The Attorney General represents the legislature and advises them. So what's my role? Certainly on the front end, it's looking at those maps, and where I believe and my team believes that the maps don't meet the constitutional standards, one person, one vote, when you're doing right by Marylanders and not diluting votes of different certain communities, whether it's based on race, ethnicity, or even partisanship, then as the Attorney General, you should be advising the General Assembly about that as your client. When the General Assembly passes those maps, though, it is the responsibility of the Attorney General to defend those maps, whether personally you agree with them or not. So that's where the difficulty arises for every attorney, whether you're Attorney General or you're in private practice. Regarding your question about independent commissions versus partisan commissions, look, 8 years ago, when I was running statewide, I took the position. I supported independent commissions. We have seen around the country, as a member of Congress, speaking with my colleagues from around the country in states that have adopted independent commissions, many of those independent commissions aren't as independent as you think, because the appointing authority, often a governor or a legislature, they infuse partisanship into the appointment or selection of the committee. So while in principle I support independent commissions, I do believe that inherently it is a political decision, redistricting. So long as you're abiding by the constitutional constraints in redistricting, you're not involved in unlawful gerrymandering, you're always going to get maps that look pretty funky, if that's a technical term. But I do believe that the maps that as you look at the congressional maps today that the General Assembly passed, certainly seem to be much more compact than they were 10 years ago. They're not as compact as perhaps they could be, but I believe that they will likely survive the challenges that are presented in court. And the same, I think, can be said for the state legislative maps.
So your prediction is that that the Court of Appeals will not go with the governor's lawsuits on this?
I don't think they will. I think that they're going to evaluate the maps that were enacted by the legislature a few weeks ago, back in December, and they'll uphold them. It's not a question of whether these are the best districts. It's whether they are whether they meet the constitutional standards and requirements, and not only the federal, but also in Maryland. In terms of do they cross over too many county lines and things like that. So I think they'll be upheld, and I think the legislative maps will as well.
Interesting. Well, we're looking forward to seeing those play out in the next month or so.
That's right.
You brought up the issue of criminal justice. Obviously, in your time in the House of Delegates, I know you passed a lot of legislation, particularly on drunk driving, domestic violence. That was some of your focus down there. I guess one of the questions I have is Attorney General Frosch was down advocating for the ban on ghost guns. I've heard you speak about that before as well. I assume that you're in favor of the legislation that's down in Annapolis right now?
Yes. In fact, Brian and I were testifying back to back. I was down the same
You were there
day.
as well,
Yep.
Okay. So I guess Chairman Smith, my former vice chair and now the chairman of judicial proceedings, had raised a question at one of the hearings and asking some of the advocacy groups why that they were down testifying on the ghost gun bill, but yet were very silent when it came to things about handguns use in the commission of crime. So the Senate, not the House, but the Senate has passed the governor, some version of the governor's bills, raising the stakes for individuals for repeat violent offenders, use of the handgun in the commission of a felony, use of drugs and violent crimes and so forth. Where do you fall on all of this, and what role can the Attorney General's office play in assisting? There's a huge crime wave, particularly in Baltimore City.
Sure. Well, first of all, as Chief Legal Officer, the Attorney General plays an important role in legislation that is considered and ultimately passed or rejected by the Maryland General Assembly, because I think that the credibility and the weight of that office, the resident expertise and knowledge and understanding about these matters. So that Brian was down in Annapolis last week testifying in support of the ban on ghost guns, I think, is significant. Maryland's made a lot of progress when it comes to gun safety and gun regulation. You'll remember back in 2013, Maryland was the only state in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook massacre that passed meaningful gun safety regulation. We banned assault weapons, large capacity magazines. We incorporated training requirements to get a permit to purchase a gun, background checks, fingerprinting. So Maryland has always led the way, and I don't think there's any one piece of legislation that is sort of, the panacea, the end-all, be-all to taking guns off the street and improving public safety. So that you had a lot of advocates testifying on, banning ghost guns, but maybe fewer advocates on other issues, doesn't mean that ghost guns is the only thing we need to ban in order to improve the public safety in communities around Maryland. I think we've got to do it all. The issue that I have with the governor's approach is the governor puts a lot of emphasis on the severity of the offense as somehow being a deterrent to crime. When I speak with prosecutors, judges, law enforcement, more important than the severity of the crime is the swiftness or speed of justice. So that's why I support proposals which a number of council members in Baltimore City have been talking about. I believe there's legislation in Annapolis to at least pilot, and that's a gun court. A gun court. If those who possess guns understand that their day in court will come sooner rather than later, I think that's a greater deterrent than increasing the penalties on gun possession or even gun-related crimes. Does that mean that we should reduce the penalties? Absolutely not. But do we believe that increasing penalties somehow is going to be a deterrent? I don't think the facts warrant that. So while they're not mutually exclusive, you can consider ghost guns at the same time that you consider enhanced penalties for certain crimes. I think what's not being talked about enough is how do you improve the efficiency and the speed in the criminal justice system, particularly when it comes to gun cases. As an Attorney General, that would be a top priority of mine. Swift justice, swift investigations, prosecutions, and where the facts warrant, convictions. I think that's going to serve as a much greater deterrent and to get guns off the streets in not just Baltimore City, but wherever around the state of Maryland.
Okay. Switching a little bit, you had brought up the issue of police reform, obviously a hot topic. In last year's General Assembly, you talked about the Attorney General's role and what the General Assembly gave to the Attorney General, and the issue of prosecutions. Where do you fall on the Attorney General having that authority? Is that a good idea? And what else, if anything, should the General Assembly be looking at in terms of that issue?
I think it's essential that the Attorney General has the authority to prosecute. I think my position is a little bit different than others. I would establish the authority in the way where, after the investigation, if the facts warrant a prosecution, then the local state's attorney should have right of first refusal. It's their jurisdiction. They prosecute crimes. If that state's attorney has the ability, the resources, the will to take the case, great. If that state's attorney is unwilling to take it, or maybe they don't have the resources, it could be a complicated case. Think about a small jurisdiction in Maryland where it may overwhelm that prosecutor's office, then I think the Attorney General should be able to bring that case. So I'm for expanding authority so that the Attorney General can prosecute law enforcement where the investigation supports a prosecution, where the facts show misconduct that led to the death, but only as a sort of an alternative to a state's attorney declining to take the case. I've had conversations with state's attorneys, a number of them, at least 3, over the last 2 months about this very issue. And while the State's Attorneys Association objected to giving the Attorney General that investigative power, they're likely to take a public position not supporting extending it to prosecution. Most states' attorneys will tell you privately that if the Attorney General is going to investigate it, the Attorney General might as well prosecute it. Because for most states' attorneys, as they're approaching a case and they're thinking about their theory of the case, that is going to shape their investigation. So if the investigation is done by the Attorney General, and then the Attorney General says, okay, state's attorney, you have to prosecute based on my investigation, you may put the state's attorney into a position where that wasn't my theory of the case. That's not how I would have presented it, and it makes it for a more difficult prosecution. So most state's attorneys will tell you privately, at least, if the Attorney General is going to prosecute it, if the Attorney General is going to investigate it, let the Attorney General prosecute it.
Anything else that the General Assembly should be looking at? For example, a hot national topic is this whole idea of doing away with sovereign immunity, which I have asked some questions about, and I know Chairman Smith has asked some questions about. There are a lot of details to that. Should the General Assembly be looking at that? Are there other things in this realm that they should be looking at? There's obviously some questions about what they did last year and definitions of use of force and things of that nature. Like, what else, if anything, should they be doing at this point, or have they done enough, do you think?
Look, this is where being a member of Congress, right, I can sit here and tell you not just what I believe and what I think and what I promise. I've got a record of where I stand on this issue, and it's called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which we passed twice in the U.S. House of Representatives in the sad aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. The bill is sitting in the U.S. Senate. But we've done a number of things that I would certainly commend to the General Assembly to consider and pass in Maryland. Some they did. For example, we banned in that bill that's sitting in the Senate, we proposed banning the chokehold. They did that in Maryland. Banning the no-knock warrants. The General Assembly did that. But there are many other things that we considered and that the General Assembly should consider. For example, given the Attorney General and state's attorneys the authority to conduct pattern and practice investigations to see what kinds of problems, systemic problems we have in departments around either a county or the state. Eliminating what you mentioned, qualified immunity. There is an obstacle to bringing civil and criminal actions against those police officers who engage in misconduct. And in the George Floyd Justice and Policing, we eliminate those obstacles. Some people will cry that the sky is falling. Colorado's already done it and the sky isn't falling. They're still recruiting men and women to their police departments. So we can hold law enforcement accountable. We can support and fund law enforcement so they can do effective policing in the community. We can do both at the same time. So if you look at the George Floyd justice and policing and some of those components, those are what I would recommend to the General Assembly to make further progress on. The qualified immunity, the pattern and practice investigation. Also, for example, we not only, we fund body cameras for all law enforcement, 18,000 departments around the country. You can't just mandate body cameras when some small departments can't afford body cameras. So I would suggest we need to mandate, but we have to fund police body cameras, because we've seen how valuable they've been, not only in showing misconduct, but also body cameras help law enforcement. It helps them in training, and it also helps them in any defense they need to make to show that their conduct was appropriate for the circumstances that they faced.
So tying a couple of your issues together, interesting. So if the General Assembly did what you asked, which is to give the Attorney General's office more authority to pursue civil rights violations, let's say, so against a police officer, for example, and you got rid of qualified immunity for police officers, I guess my question is, how does this all kind of work together? You know, you think about Baltimore City, it's hard for them to, in fact, their training classes in the city, in the county, in Montgomery County, Prince George's County are way down. Like, they can't attract officers now. How does it all work with something like qualified immunity if you are essentially forcing a police officer, I guess, to get liability insurance on top of whatever else is going on, and they are now civilly liable? They don't make a lot of money to begin with. A place like Baltimore, I'm sorry to throw a lot at you.
Yeah.
I just kind of want to hear how it all works. In Baltimore
Sure.
City, they make $60,000, and it's probable that liability insurance for them would usurp that and then some.
Sure.
How does it all work?
Sure. Well, Colorado has demonstrated that it can work, because Colorado dramatically reduced or limited qualified immunity if they didn't altogether throw it out, and yet they didn't experience any recruitment problems beyond the current challenges that every police department is faced with recruitment, which even was true before the George Floyd incident and these series of police reform measures that have cropped up around the country. Recruiting police and fire has been very, very tough for the last several years. But Colorado has demonstrated that you can narrow qualified immunity, allow for families to be compensated for police misconduct, and still have effective policing. One of the proposals, which I support, is that by eliminating qualified immunity, you essentially give the family, the victim, the opportunity to recover for their loss. Now, some want to use it to penalize the police officer, which goes to your problem. I mean, then I have to buy liability insurance. And some other advocates say, well, hold the department liable. Either way, I'm actually fine with that, because the focus is not on necessarily who's writing the check, but enabling the families to recover. While no amount of money will ever make a family whole for certainly loss of life at the hands of the police or some of the injuries suffered, it gives the family the opportunity to recover. And whether it's the police officer or the department that ultimately writes the check, we can figure that out.
Can I jump in on that one,
Yeah,
Bobby?
of course.
Because when you talk about the purpose being not to penalize anybody but to compensate, I think you're hitting a chord there. Would you make that kind of compensation subject to the general civil compensation limits in Maryland, where Maryland, of course, has a limit on non-economic loss, as we
Right.
say? You just said no amount of money can ever compensate someone for the loss of life of a family member. But in Maryland, that's what we call non-economic loss.
Right.
It's emotional loss, to be
Right.
sure. Would you subject those claims to the same limits that general negligence claims have in Maryland?
I would say for starters, I think that's what we should do, right? One of the things I learned in Annapolis, and this is where I really do believe my experience in Annapolis is really important when it comes to voters considering who the next Attorney General is, because as the Attorney General, you have to work with legislators, scoping out the authorities and the responsibilities. So I understand that the way that the legislature works, and they work incrementally. I think we should all, seek bold transformational change, but the reality is often progress happens incrementally. So I would suggest that not disrupt the caps on liability under sort of negligence and tort standards today. Let's get first beyond the qualified immunity, okay, and then once we do that, we can evaluate whether or not justice is being served for the families in those cases.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, not at all. I know you know a lot about this issue. So let me move away from that just for one second. There's so many issues to talk about, as you said. The Attorney General Frosch has been deeply involved in access to justice issues, and I want to ask a little bit about one in particular has to do with talking about right to counsel and things like that in evictions, which I know Natalie has some questions on later on. So I don't want to steal her thunder. There's some legislation in Annapolis right now dealing with what's called, I guess, just cause evictions. I just wanted to see what you thought about that. Essentially telling landlords that they're not allowed to evict people. They're not that they can't just evict them, but they must re-let to those individuals unless they have a reason not to. So essentially the state saying you must continue to lease to these individuals, I guess, in perpetuity unless you have a reason not to. Thoughts about that issue, thoughts about kind of where we are with evictions and right to counsel. I know it's something that, Brian was deeply involved in.
Sure. I mean, first of all, whether you own a home or whether you rent your home, there needs to be security in your living situation, okay? And as I understand the just cause eviction proposal, so long as a tenant or renter is abiding by the terms of the lease, then they can't be evicted. Well, that kind of makes sense because as a homeowner, provided that I am abiding by the terms of my loan documents, my mortgage, then I can't be foreclosed on. And there's a sense of security in that. I know what my expected behaviors and obligations are. And I do think that the same should be extended to renters. So long as you abide by the terms of your lease, you should not face either certainly eviction or the termination of lease. Now, I understand that there may be times where the owner of the apartment, or sometimes, we're talking about small dwelling units, 1 or 2, 3 or 4, where maybe you're selling, maybe you want to convert it from rental to a fee simple type of arrangement. Those I would hope are incorporated in the proposed legislation and does give the owner an opportunity to get out of being a landlord-tenant arrangement. But I do generally support the just cause eviction proposals that are in Annapolis. I also believe that that tenants should have some form of representation in these landlord-tenant disputes. Now, the Office of the Attorney General provides a lot of information to both landlords and tenants when disputes arise. So the Attorney General's office is not involved in the actual cases themselves. But I do believe that a tenant for whom, that can be a very stressful, difficult time in their life, a lot of things perhaps going on, the assistance of counsel, I think, is useful. So I would support the efforts to create some funding mechanism to provide minimum representation to tenants facing eviction.
All right. I'm going to turn it back to Natalie. I have more, but I don't want to
We're trying to share here.
We're going back and forth. This is our,
so let me ask you this question. Back, you may be too young to remember this, but I remember back in the day when I was a young lawyer, that people would go from private practice to the Attorney General's office and then back to private practice again, taking back and forth with them the differing expertise of the different settings they came from. And you mentioned a time in private practice for yourself. Which do you nowadays, as you may know, a lot of the people in the Attorney General's office are more career government attorneys. Do you think one is preferable to the other, and if so, which one?
I think a mix. I think you want a mix. I think that in any public office, whether it's the Department of Justice or whether it's the Maryland Attorney General's office. Same could probably be said of a state's attorney's office. You certainly want people who have been there for a long time. They have the institutional knowledge, the experience, the relationships, so you certainly want that. In fact, I think the same can be said about the United States Congress. You want a few people there that have got that institutional knowledge, but it's always good to have rotation, right? People often ask about term limits in Congress, which I'm against, because there's actually natural rotation in Congress. It brings new energy, new ideas. And I think the same can be said about what I would like to see in the Office of the Attorney General. You certainly want turnover. You want people who've had experience in the private sector, on the other side of the table, coming to the Attorney General's office and bringing that experience, that understanding, that perspective. I don't think there's a formula that you can design for that. You want to encourage people to pursue their interests, their dreams in their profession. So certainly as the Attorney General, I will encourage people to stay for as long as they want, so long as they're doing the job. And for those that want to rotate out and rotate in, we're going to welcome people as well. I will use the opportunity to say that I am committed to diversity, equity, inclusion in the office, and the Office of the Attorney General needs to reflect the composition of Maryland. And I want to see by gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and geography.
So how would you attract those young lawyers or keep those career lawyers, given the disparity in compensation, if you will, between private practice and at least the current pay scales in the Attorney General's?
Well, I think to keep the current, I would have to go back in some archive and find the speech that Steve Sachs gave. This is a story that was relayed to me recently. On the first day as the Attorney General, and he spoke to the men and women assembled, who he knew then, and it's still the case today, are paid considerably less than what the federal government pays their attorneys and what many counties pay their attorney, and certainly well below the starting rate in the private sector. But about how noble the work is, how important the work is, how indispensable their effort, their passion, and their energy is to making Maryland a great state, to improving the quality of life in Maryland. So as the Attorney General, you've got to inspire the troops because they're doing often what is thankless work for less than what they could make elsewhere. So you want to inspire and motivate and take good care of the men and women who work in the Office of the Attorney General. And then to recruit, it's about relationships, right? It's relationships with the Maryland State Bar Association and being actively involved in the different committees, the different task force. It's being actively engaged in our law schools. We've got 2 wonderful law schools in Maryland and also in the District of Columbia, and having a relationship there so we can recruit some of the best and brightest. And I think it also includes having a relationship with, beyond the Maryland State Bar Association, with members of the legal profession with the law firms, the big ones and the small ones, and having those relationships. Although I don't want a managing partner thinking I'm coming to lunch just to poach some of their talent, but I do think having those healthy engagements as well, sharing with members of the profession the opportunities, the rewarding opportunities in the Office of the Attorney General.
Well, back in the day, it used to be considered a privilege to go over there for a couple of years and represent the state of Maryland and to frankly pick up knowledge and experience that could be only gained in that setting. So with all due respect, I wouldn't see it as poaching.
Yeah.
I'd see it as an opportunity for a young lawyer to get valuable experience.
That's right.
In public service, especially if their firm knew that they were going to come back.
That's right.
Because that would pay off. But let me ask you a different question, because you said you want them to be able to pursue their dreams and also, I assume, have their families and support their families and all that good stuff. What would you do, if anything, to, for instance, I had a hearing recently with somebody from the Attorney General's office, and of course it was all being done remotely, and the Assistant Attorney General was doing the hearing on her own personal cell phone because the state had not provided her with the technological equipment to do it. What would you do to increase or improve not just the compensation but the support to attorneys general, assistants?
And that's critical because in any profession, and the legal profession is the same, people want to work for an employer who's providing them the best technologies, the best resources, the facilities, the training programs, and the opportunities. Look, we're in a place now in the legal profession, in the medical profession, in America broadly, where we've got to relook how we do business, and that's going to require us to shift and lift resources. What do I mean by that? For example, with more teleworking, more remote and virtual engagements, a lot of private sector companies are looking at reducing their footprint. That's going to lower their real estate costs, and presumably they're going to take that money and they're going to invest it in the technologies, the computers, the cell phones, the broadband to connect their employees remotely. We need to do that in state government as well, and not just in the office of the Attorney General. You're going to see fewer and fewer state government employees who are going to show up on the job because they can do in the office because they can do it from home. I believe soon that's going to almost be a demand among employees, the labor force. They're going to be looking for that benefit, right? And they're going to be asking that question in interviews. How many days a week do I get to work from home? So as that becomes a reality, we're going to be able to save costs, utility costs, the lease costs, and you've got to pour that back into the technologies to support the men and women who are working from home.
And we mentioned access to justice a minute ago. I don't want to let you leave today without talking about that, because I don't know if you've probably heard that our Access to Justice Commission, which is part of the Maryland State Bar Association, had the privilege of working very closely with Attorney General Frosch on the whole access to justice issue in light of the pandemic. And Bobby mentioned earlier the whole access to justice and access to counsel in evictions. What do you see as the most serious access to justice issues, and how would you as Attorney General work to address those?
Look, I think one of the most important access to justice issues, you talked about right to counsel, and we talked about in the eviction context right now, and I'm thinking about this in terms of like my public safety ideas and vision. It's access to counsel for juveniles, children in the juvenile justice system, and I do support legislation that essentially says that no child can be questioned either without the consent of their parent or the presence of counsel. You shouldn't even be able to ask a child to waive their right to remain silent. There are a number of bills in the General Assembly that are focused on our children. It happens to be when they get in trouble, we call them juveniles, but they're still children. And I also support the proposal not to automatically waive up to adult court children who commit offenses, but it should be taken on a case-by-case basis. 8 out of 10 children who are waived up to adult court are found not guilty. And those 8 out of 10 found not guilty, they now do not have access to the benefits that come with being in the juvenile justice system, whether it's the counseling, the mental health, the drug and addiction treatment. So waiving children up to adult court, even when they're found not guilty, deprives them of many of the services that they need. So I think in terms of access to justice and the quality of justice that we're delivering, for me, I put a big premium on what we're doing for our children.
Do you mind if I jump in on that?
Please.
I wanted to ask.
I know that was a big issue for you, juvenile justice, when you were in the legislature.
Right. Yeah, no, and it's continues to be a problem in the state. I did want to ask you about the interrogation bill, though, because that's an interesting one to have brought up. What do you do if you're a law enforcement officer and you're on the scene, let's say, of a school shooting, right? And you get there, it's not, the interrogation is any custodial interrogation, and so that can be on the scene when you have the kid in handcuffs who was just shooting up a school. Law enforcement wants to ask a question such as, are there any accomplices? Are there weapons? Are there bombs? That legislation, if I read it correctly, would prohibit law enforcement from asking any of those public safety type questions that are normal for law enforcement to do unless they get permission from a parent who may not be around or an attorney who may not be around. How does that work? And doesn't that there's a lot of rumblings about that particular piece of legislation about how that can endanger lives. Like, how does that work in practice on a scene such as a school shooting when you need to know quickly what's going on out there.
Sure, and we know that currently under case law there are these exigent circumstances exemptions to many of the rights that are afforded to those who are detained or in custody. Certainly, in an exigent circumstance like that, I would think that that right would be forfeited, and that the law enforcement on the scene, in order to minimize additional risk and harm and danger, should be able to question. I mean, without a doubt. I mean, the goal here, it's often these are all balancing acts, right? It's you need to protect the public, and you need to protect the rights of the individual. So it's all a balancing act. And certainly, if other lives can be in danger, but for the ability to get information from a child, then you've got to be able to get that information.
And in terms of the other legislation, the waive up, waive down, do you think that I think the bill, I believe it was Senator Carter who put the bill in, should all cases start in the juvenile system and then get waived up, or are there certain crimes such as murder or rape or whatever that should automatically start in the adult system and have a waiver down? It's always, I mean, 20 some odd years ago, you and I were talking about this in the General Assembly. What's the correct balance as to where, because obviously if you have to waive a case up, some murderer that gets left in juvenile court isn't going to have anything on their record come the age of 21. And
right, but that's if you accept the premise that cases can't get waived up. I mean, look, I think for starters, all cases should start in juvenile and they get waived up. I think that if the facts, the data show that there's difficulty waiving up homicides, even when the facts would support a waiver. If we've got that kind of problem, then we got to go in and we've got to work with it. That's a nice thing. The legislature meets every year, and you have an opportunity to come back and make changes and make improvements. But my concern is that even when you have a group of offenses where it automatically goes to adult court, you're going to have those cases where, someone died. Okay, it may or may not end up being a homicide committed by the person who's being detained, but now this child is in adult court with none of the supports available in the juvenile system. So I would start in juvenile and waive up.
Okay.
I want to follow up on something you said earlier about relationships, though, and this is a conversation I had with somebody else last year, and the relationship between the Maryland State Bar and the Attorney General's office. Because you mentioned a minute ago about the Attorney General trying to serve people in all these different capacities, consumer protection, labor laws, everything else. What can the MSBA do to help the Attorney General's office, and what can the Attorney General's office do to take advantage of the expertise? Because we got, like I said, 40,000 or so legal professionals who can help in this endeavor if given an assignment.
Sure.
So how can we work together to solve some of these problems that you mentioned?
Great question. As you know, there are probably at least 30 or 40 different commissions and committees and task forces that the Attorney General is either a member of, Attorney General, his or her designee, or chairs. And many of those commissions, and they range everything from sentencing reform, advisory commissions, to commissions on how to improve Maryland's cyber security and identity theft laws. And many of those commissions, committees, and task forces they involve members of the public and specifically require members of the public to be attorneys with experience and expertise in those areas. So I think that's certainly one area where the Office of the Attorney General can and should, and under General Brown, will have a close relationship with MSBA as we're looking to fill those committees and task forces and commissions, because who in the community, in the legal profession has that experience, that expertise, that interest. So I think that's certainly a good starting point there. But even before we get to that, after I win in November, I'm going to have a transition period into office, I'm going to need the MSBA to help me out as we're sort of looking at and evaluating and making recommendations on how to improve, build on the work that Brian has done in the Office of the Attorney General.
And we'd be happy to help with that. What we'd really like to do too is get everybody in the Attorney General's office to be a member of the MSBA, so we can work together.
Okay, we've got to work on that too.
Both of those.
It reminds me of when I was in the Army, and you report for duty that very first day to the commanding officer, and one of the things that the commanding officer mentioned always was, we've got an officers club. Now, I can't force you to be in the officers club, but
I can encourage you.
I can encourage you.
Okay.
Yeah. Here's your application.
Anything else we can? Let me give you a minute. If there's anything else you want to talk about today that we haven't touched on.
Can I ask a question before
course
you?
you
I
may.
want to ask one quick political question,
Yeah.
and I plan on asking your opponent in the Democratic primary about the enormous elephant in the room for those of us who are in the political world. You are running against an O'Malley, and I remember stickers with the O'Malley Brown or Brown O'Malley, whatever. And I guess the question that I would ask to you is, is there any political discomfort running against your primary opponent being, a friend of yours, the wife of your former partner in legislative government, and how has that been before we get to the close of it? And I will ask Judge O'Malley that question as well.
Primaries are always difficult and awkward in that regard because, and I'm sure the Republicans would say the same. You're in a Democratic primary. People who you spend more time with, you befriend, you're close to, you share so many things in common, your thoughts about government, your vision, your priorities. And then every 2 years if you're in Congress, 4 years if you're running for state office, boom, you find yourselves on the opposite side of people who you've been working with closely for 3.5 years. So it always happens in primaries. But this one probably has to be the most awkward.
Right.
And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Sorry, I apologize. I just was curious.
It's a fair question, of course, but an awkward one. Thanks.
Yes.
But anyway, we do have a few minutes left, not a lot. So anything else that you want to share with us or with the people of Maryland?
What I would share is that, the Office of the Attorney General under the Maryland Constitution is required to be an attorney. But that's not the only sort of experience and qualification that is essential, I think, to be an effective Attorney General. I think about the greats like Joe Curran. Joe Curran was a former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland before he was Attorney General. Joe Curran served in the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Senate where he was in leadership. And when I compare my experience to Joe Curran's, it's nearly identical. I served as Lieutenant Governor. I served in leadership in the House Judiciary Committee. But the reason why that's important is because as Attorney General, and we talked about this today, you represent the state. And how better able to represent your client when you've been in your client's shoes? So I'm going to represent the state, and I served as Lieutenant Governor leading the state. I'm going to represent the people as the people's lawyer, and I've spent 8 years in Annapolis and now almost 6 years in Capitol Hill representing the people, advocating for the people, fighting for them. And so I think it's important when voters go to the polls and they look at the experience of the candidates to look broadly at the complete record, experience, and background that each of us can bring to the office to get the big things done, the important things done.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Terrific. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.